the superimposed front, the buried front, two terms on the different parts of the spectrum, and I hope to give you a picture why I use these two terms in the following 20 minutes. In August 1914, the Austro-Hungarian 1st, 3rd, 4th armies moved into position in Galicia and were soon followed by the 2nd Army. Thus, in autumn 1914, 2/3 of the Austro-Hungarian formations were fighting in the northeastern front, as it was called out from the point of view of Vienna. Also, a first glance at the literature of Remembrance, published between 1914 and 1939, clearly shows the dominance of the Eastern Front. Of the 272 bibliographical entries studied, 159 deal with the Eastern Front, 75 with the fighting at the Isonzo and the Piave, 113 with the war in the Alps, 41 with Serbia, and 88 with other theaters of war and other topics. Today, a brief examination of the Austrian scholarly literature, however, presents a different picture. Manfred Rauchensteiner's definitive book, Der Tod des Doppeladlers, which appeared in 1993 and which became an update, at least 50% more update, last year, amply reflects the war in the East, yet his is nearly the only one. The collection published by Bernhard Bachinger and I in, last fall, Jenseits des Schützengrabens, was one of the first books in Austria that focused on the war on the Eastern Front. Of course, there are a number of dissertation thesis articles which deal with some specific aspects of the Eastern Front in Austria, such as Richard Lein's dissertation, Pflichterfüllung and Hochverrat, and as well as different essays by Lothar Höbelt, just to mention. But there's no volume, no monography on the Eastern Front out from Austrian historiography. The apparent fixation on the Western Front in German, and in Germany the situation is pretty the same. Only in America there are more and more books also on the Eastern Front. A vast number of monography. The situation in the Remembrance culture is pretty different. A vast number of monographs, collections, trade books, films, exhibitions, and other media works have been produced on the war in the Isonzo and the Alps. I just passed pro toto this new film on the war in the Alps. There are a number of reasons for this situation. First, of course, there is simply the fact that the Isonzo Front's geographical proximity to present-day Austria, of course. Second, the war in the Isonzo was witness to industrialized machine warfare, which through the cars took on an additional dimension. Also through the Paris peace treaties and the ethnic minority conflicts that dominated Austria in the entire 20th century, the struggle of the First World War was never laid to rest. However, there was also a fourth aspect. The First World War on the Eastern Front was far more elusive. It lacked a clear signature and was even characterized by the occasional absence of war and a peculiar chronological open-endedness. It didn't end in November 1918. There are big discussions when the First World War in Eastern Europe ended, I would say in the early 1920s, around the Second Peace of Riga. Since most of the Central and Eastern European countries that came into existence after or in 1918 were caught up in processes of identity formation and definition, and there was no place for remembering the First World War, and thus no place for narratives or narrators on the war in the East. It was the war of a monarchy now shunned for the most part. Those groups opposed to the unwanted state took center stage, such as the Czech Legion or the Green Cadres. Yet the war on the Eastern Front was not forgotten or repressed, but simply buried by narratives, by other narratives. Why is it nonetheless important to study particularly the war experience of personal accounts of German-speaking Austro-Hungarian soldiers involved in the fighting on the Eastern Front? This paper argues that the pictures of the East present in society and thus in the midst of the German-speaking soldiers of the Habsburg monarchy before summer 1914 seem to be confirmed by their war experience from 1914 to 1918. The increasing of anti-Slavic and anti-Russian sentiment during the war, the anti-Semitism, and the talk of the lack of culture, a multicultural chaos, and empty countryside were discourse metaphors for seizing this region. It is interesting that these images are quite similar across the various social levels of the military personnel. Finally, one short note on the method and the sources. I analyzed unpublished diaries and memoirs from German-speaking soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian forces. The focus was on different forms of war experience, for example, violence, space, identity, and remembrance. I set these discursive images in contrast to visual images from the Austrian State Archives War Archive and images of selected newspapers. Imagined space. This study assumes that the subject analyzes experienceable space as a social field. This means that imagined spaces are created in the process of perception. These images of space are either related to social processes of interaction or are intentionally designed for the purposes of realizing a particular space. This means that geographic space and its apparently objective characteristics are perceived and described against a pre-existing background and are contextualized in this process. A diary entry of the volunteer Gottfried Klein, who was born in Vienna in 1894, provides a clear example of this. He was assigned to the 3rd Dragoon Regiment. In March 1916, he was promoted to platoon leader. His diary shows how the combatants tried to make sense of their impressions of the foreign landscape in the East through a familiar one. Quote, "The route was scenic. First in hilly terrain to Standesitz, then along the stream through the forest. Our path continued over quite a hill into a magnificent forest of tall trees. The region is gorgeous. In the background, we saw the Carpathian Mountains and even 2 snow-covered mountains. And the area is beautiful, from conifer and broadleaf forests to the most gorgeous, lush meadows. I always enjoy the charming region, which reminds me partly of Igls and Salzburg and partly of Semmering and Glocknitz." End of quote. This is a war diary. Space and its cultural contexts are put into a relation, thus fulfilling confounding expectations. The new hybrid image of space created in this way, however, is not a static one, but it is reinterpreted over the course of time and by the individual as well as the social discourses. Along the way, certain elements of the constructed images of space become fixed, others were subsequently corrected. In summer 1914, the soldiers of the Central Powers went to war in the East with specific images in their heads. The Orient, the Eastern Europe, and Asia were 3 fundamental topoi which had been the subject of debate in Europe for a long time. Yet, as Edward Said has elaborated in his critique of Orientalism, all these encounters, even if animated by a fascination for the pomp and the splendor of the Oriental style, were dominated by the concept of the foreign, the exotic, ultimately the backward, devious savages who need to be tamed by the noble Europeans and led to the light of civilization. While it is true that a distinction was made for Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, and their images had a different nuance, the main point up into the 20th century was to establish an opposition between civilization, Europe, and barbarism, Asia. And Eastern Europe was the front line of this two poles. Civilize the East. To help justify the image and the occupation of countryside, these pictures were drawn. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that in light of Vienna and Berlin's desires before and during the First World War, the question of a possible colonialism or imperialism in the east of Europe and the Balkans has been raised again and again in the historiography of the last few decades. Physical space versus cultural space. Let's get back to the differences in the perception of physical and cultural space. People who are more or less exposed, permanently confronted by the forces of nature, tend to be very aware of the physical structure of space. They constantly keep an eye on temperature, weather conditions, the structure of the terrain, distances, and flora and fauna, and draw their conclusions out of this. Together with their concrete experiences of war, these imaginations of space from the matrix of their perceptions, but are nonetheless constructions. The artilleryman Peter Paul Greinhofer from Tyrol, for example, described the situation near the Dunajec River on 4th June 1915 as follows. Quote, "Another artillery duel rages above our heads, but we are still safe. In the evening, it starts to rain and our new enemy approaches, the water. In half an hour, it has flooded us out of our cover. Everything is turned topsy-turvy, and here come the first enemy bullets. We have to find cover, new cover." End of quote. As mentioned above, however, it is often impossible to separate descriptions of terrain and cultural space, the cleanliness or lack of thereof, the condition of the roads, the appearance of the houses, and the people living there are integral parts of the diary entry. The Upper Austrian Hans Brunner, who fought with the Royal 2nd Territorial Infantry Regiment, recorded his memories in the regimental history of the 2nd Rifles of Linz, 1956. On 4th April 1916, he has a note, quote, "Stayed the night in Lagi Polani. You can't imagine what it's like unless you haven't been in a Carpathian cottage before. We slept on the floor because the smoke and stench 1 meter above the floor were unbearable. But it was still better than sleeping outside in the muddy foxhole. For the last 4 days, we have barely escaped capture by the skin of our teeth." End of quote. In the war diary he kept from 1915 to 1918, the Austrian one-year volunteer Herbert Jandorek wrote, for example, on 14 February 1916 in an unknown town in the border between Galicia and Hungary, quote, "The town is very interesting. We hardly see anyone other than soldiers, some Jews, and some mostly and women who mostly make a dubious impression. During the day, the street is busy thanks to the chunk of the countless train cars. The houses are mostly small and shabby. Almost all of the kiosks are in an awful state. Several Russian onion domed churches liven up the scenery. At least there is still some kind of life here. The town doesn't seem to have suffered from the war." End of quote. The countryside and the local cultures were both interpreted as filthy and backward. The cultural diversity and the soldiers' confrontation with the Jewish inhabitants in particular were a very intense experience of cultural space. The diary and memory entries are dominated by the feeling of foreignness, regardless of whether they were describing their own Galicia, Bukowina, or enemy Russian Empire territory. These interpretations, however, would never have been possible without the key defining feature of the First World War in Eastern Europe, mobile warfare. on the possibility of mobile warfare or the discovery of an area for expansion, particularly for cavalrymen, even if they were serving in the infantry. Distances played an important role. They were trained to make a detailed estimate of the distance traveled and to incorporate these distances in their calculations. Their accounts clearly show this awareness of space. Cavalry Captain Gustav Gewinner, for example, from Moravian Studenka, for instance, kept a daily tally of the distances traveled and their total. I have to add all these years from 1914 until 1917, for which we have an exact number. He fought, although he was a cavalryman, only in infantry regiments. In this time, he traveled 6,358 kilometers. And in the following years, months, I would say 1,000 kilometers more have to be added, because 1918 he was stationed in the Ukraine, in the occupied Ukraine, where he fought once more as cavalry. While moving through the huge territories in the east, especially the entry into the landscape of war, as Kurt Lewin called it, left a deep impression on the soldiers. Their entrance to this landscape was marked by damaged buildings, corpses and graves. Herbert Jandarek from Grödig, a one-year volunteer in the 59th Infantry Regiment, wrote of his trip to the front, 10th February 1916. Around 6 a.m. in the morning, we arrived in Mező-Larbocs and ate breakfast. We had only made it as far as the Galician border, and yet the first traces of war could be seen on the damaged station, which had been shot to pieces. Around 9 a.m. we traveled through Lubkov. The station was shot to pieces. Houses were riddled with bullet and shell holes. Arrived at 6 a.m. in the morning in Lviv. Got breakfast. Can't see much of the war. Behind Lviv, there are large wire obstacles and trenches in the hollows. End of quote. One more quote I want to give you from Hans Haugeneder from Upper Austria, who wrote in his diary on 20th June 1916. We are passing Stary Sambar. In the afternoon, we took a long bend towards Sambar, a huge cemetery which supposedly holds 12,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers, drew our attention. Horrible battles took place here 1 year ago. A large part of the town still lies in ruins, although the miraculous powers of nature have already healed many wounds. Ever eastwards, there is hardly any place that we come across that isn't associated with some battle that casts it from its humble seclusion into public eye of many countries. Now I come to the end. The dramatic description of the landscape of war by the soldiers even underlined the impression of bringing culture back to the East. Together with the experience of distance and open space, this very intense sense of space in Eastern Europe, as well as in Southeastern Europe, contrasts sharply with the experience of war in the Isonzo Front or the war in the Alps. Their maneuvers were rather the exception, where fierce battles were fought over a few hundred meters. Following the argument from Alexander Meschnik in Der Wille zur Bewegung, I would like to raise the question of whether the experience of mobile warfare in Eastern Europe was considered as an alternative course of action in the socio-political discourses surrounding the revision of the Paris peace treaties during the interwar years. As the personal accounts examined above show, it seems evident that the simple soldiers and officers were drilled here in the experience of territorial expansion and cultural conversion. Similar to the myth of the new Baltic colonization created by the cultural policy of the German Oberkommando Ost, carried on by the Freikorps and later instrumentalized by the National Socialists, the idea of regaining control of Eastern and Southeastern Europe was one that the National Socialists could understand and support later. Further study of discourses on the East, such as those found in the interwar years in German-Austrian media, regimental histories, and organizations for veterans and returning soldiers might help shed more light on this question. And when we deal with the question, it seems the Eastern Front is not a buried, but a superimposed front, concealed above the discourses of remembrance in Central Eastern Europe after 1918. Thank you very much.